McAdams with Oregon Agricultural Trust, and I want to welcome you to this virtual tour of Oregon's wine country. Right now, I'm at the Oregon Convention Center where we were scheduled to have rally, but instead I'm really pleased to be able to meet you online and hopefully afterwards for Q&A. So the soil that I'm standing on right now is the biggest patch of Class 1 soil in the state of Oregon, and actually some of the best agricultural land in the world. As you can see, it is now paved. However, Oregon's land use program has done a stellar job of slowing the loss of Oregon's agricultural land. On today's tour, you're going to be learning from several experts about that land use program, as well as visiting Fair-Sing Vineyard and Bethel Heights Vineyard to learn about their voluntary conservation measures. And then we're going to learn about how permanent land conservation with easements can be an overlay on both of these systems. So, welcome to the tour and hop aboard! Right now we're driving through the Willamette Valley, which has some of the richest soils in the world. They were brought here by the Missoula floods thousands of years ago as glaciers melted in Missoula, Montana, and a series of floods brought rich soils that deposited here. It gives us a lot of unique growing conditions, that and our microclimates, and allows us to grow over 220 different crops in just a small area. So we are currently driving through the mid-Willamette Valley on our way to an urban growth boundary where you'll be able to see the confluence and conflicts between this rural landscape and a lot of the urbanizing landscapes, especially in the northern Willamette Valley.
From 2001 to 2016, and for context, that's a period of historically low housing starts in this country. The U.S. converted 11 million acres of agricultural land. The majority of that land, about 7 million acres, were converted to something that we're calling low-density residential development. We've known that this type of land use has been occurring because we're seeing these large, scattered housing developments cropping up and fragmenting farmland all around the country. But this is the first time that we've really been able to quantify it and map it. And once we've done that, we understand what a big threat it is. In Oregon, in this same 15-year time period, the state saw over 65,000 acres of agricultural land fragmented or lost to development. And just over half of that was converted to this low-density residential land use.
So the problem isn't just the rezoning or permitting non-agricultural uses on farmland, but those things have an impact on land that's adjacent to or nearby. So for instance, some things that happen are if you get a patchwork of non-farm uses in an area, the farms that are left in between find it harder to continue their operations because of conflicts that are happening in the region. So eventually some of those stop being farmed, even though there's not other uses occurring on them, but they are being taken out of production nonetheless. Another thing that happens in situations like that is farmers slowly start to come to the conclusion that there isn't a long-term future in farming their area. So they will stop making investments in their operation and in the land that they're farming, and eventually stop farming it as well, whether other uses have been permitted or not.
We're standing out here really on the edge of an urban growth boundary in a suburb of Portland, Oregon. And when you look at where we're standing, we're inside the urban growth boundary here, but just off to the edge here is the actual edge of the urban growth boundary. Agricultural land out here to this direction. Residential development inside the urban growth boundary here, and then off here to the right, some more development that looks to be kind of commercial or industrial in character. So we're right out on the edge. Development occurring right within inside the urban growth boundary. It's symptomatic of what we're dealing with in the Portland metro area. Oregon's land use planning program was the result of a lot of real concerns in the late 60s, early 70s about unorganized sprawl out onto specifically Willamette Valley farmland, but it was happening all over the state with recreational development in Central Oregon and coastal development like condominium development like on the Oregon coast. There was a general concern about disorganized, as the term I've heard used, sprawling development around Oregon. The champion that really began this discussion was Governor Tom McCall. He had a knack for amplifying issues and really brought to the forefront the concerns that he had and a lot of other people had about this sprawling development. There's a lot of other champions that ultimately it was passed in 1973 and established Senate Bill 100. The Oregon Planning Program, in terms of how it works, has a couple of key components. One is to contain urban sprawl in within the urban areas of existing cities, contain rural residential development where it has occurred, while not promoting additional rural residential development. And on the other side of the coin, once you've identified those areas, protect our working landscape. So protect agricultural lands, protect forest lands for farm and forest use. So it's really about managed, contained growth and protecting our valuable resource lands.
We're focusing today on the wine industry, in part because of this industry's commitment and dedication to conserving its lands. In Oregon, this has taken the form of conserving the native oak habitat that the wine industry is in some places replacing.
There's one. These are all the old oaks that we're trying to replace. The place that we're here today is Faircine Vineyard. My wife Marion and I purchased this land back in 2005, and it was a clear-cut forest. It's about 200 acres. We've restored most of the forest. We've planted about 18,000 trees. We now have about 100 acres of certified sustainable forest. And then we've also planted a vineyard. We have about 100 acres of vineyard, about 55 acres of vines planted. Faircine is a Celtic word meaning bountiful. And we see this as a bountiful site.
In 2 minutes. Well, you can edit it too, right?
Right.
You can just
That's
chop
right.
it up.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to Bethel Heights Vineyard. My name is Pat Dudley. I was one of the founders, along with the rest of my family, of this vineyard, Bethel Heights, that was originally established in 1977. We've become very much convinced that part of our responsibility here, and you can kind of see the evidence of it, is to help preserve the soil and the biodiversity that's all around us. Old vines are not that common anymore because the oldest vines were susceptible to phylloxera and have been replanted. But these guys, you can see it's almost like a tree. This is more than 40 years old now and still healthy. And we attribute some of that to my daughter's stewardship here and her encouragement of using composting and no-till and all the practices that she's been very much advocating.
So we're standing right now on Bethel Heights' original estate vineyard. It's a 56-acre parcel, and I was a little baby here when my parents got here, and our first vines went in the ground here, and we're actually standing above the spring-fed ravine where most of our oak conservation efforts have been focused. This is where we had the most intact oak maple habitat, and so we've been releasing the oaks that are here and then also doing recruitment in our headland areas. When we find seedlings, we flag them, we don't mow them, we try to encourage them So this is the area where we've been flagging seedlings and doing some active recruitment and protecting them so that they don't get mowed. This would be a field that would get regularly mowed, and so we have our crew come out and sort of cut around to identify the seedlings, and then the mowing will kind of happen around them. And my mom sometimes ties some nice little yellow ribbons around them so that nobody misses them. But they're actually coming right along. These have grown quite a bit this year.
I was inspired listening to Mimi Castile talk about the oaks and the way this whole valley was covered with them. And so we stepped up to be a founding member of the Oak Accord. And what that meant was we paid a forest specialist to come out, survey our 200 acres, and identify where were the best places to plant oaks. It takes a little time to develop the Oak Accord savannas. We start with an acorn. This was planted last fall. I put an acorn in this pot. I actually put it in a coffee cup and then got it to sprout and then transplanted it to this pot. And this is about 9 months old, little oak tree. This same oak tree was the same process, but it's about 1.5, 2 years old. And here's one of our oak trees that's about 5 years old. And you can see that we've planted them about every 30 foot, because once this gets to be grown up in about 150 years, they'll start crowding each other. But you can see this grassland now is being returned to an oak savanna.
My name is Mimi Castile, and my vineyard is called Hopewell. We also have a farm. And my reason for being here is that I'm the co-founder of the Oak Accord with my friend Nicole.
Hi everybody, Nicole Manis with Willamette Partnership. I'm also co-founder of the Oak Accord. We are a conservation nonprofit organization based in Portland. We've been working on resilient habitat restoration issues for the past 10 years in the Willamette Valley and more broadly in Oregon. So as a conservation organization, we were really keenly aware that in Oregon there are no regulatory protections for oak. There were no limitations on how conversion was happening across the Willamette Valley. And in that effort to restore really small pockets of endangered species habitat, I was visiting all of these properties and realizing that oak was kind of declining from benign neglect. And I had landowners asking what should they do about this habitat type. And not being an oak ecologist or specialist, I sort of didn't have an answer for them, and I didn't really have a clear place to point them in terms of where to go for an oak-specific restoration program. And the more conversations Mimi and I had about what we were both seeing anecdotally across the Willamette Valley, we realized that there was really a need to bring private landowners and at first pass vineyard owners into this conversation about how to be a kind of ahead of the curve voluntary force for protecting and restoring and ideally expanding oak conservation in the Willamette.
What happens generally when a vineyard is being developed is there will be some big, beautiful, stately oaks, and a lot of times farmers will try to leave those and work around them, but that kind of doesn't achieve the end goal of long-term restoration and preservation of this habitat type. There's no attention to the associated species, the recruitment of new oak trees, especially as some of these, several 100-year-old trees start to decay and die. What we're seeing is that the decline of the habitat is really, like Nicole said, due to benign neglect. People don't recognize that as they mow their beautiful headlands around their tightly manicured vineyards, they're taking out all the seedlings that would replace those oaks that are starting to fail. And then also the grassland ecosystem that's associated with this habitat type, the wildflowers, the diversity of grasses, those are also going away. As an Oregonian, one of the things I've always been most proud of is our land use tradition here and how we've protected agricultural land, how we've protected critical habitat. And one of the really unique things about the Oak Accord is that there's 3% left of oak habitat that would have been in the Willamette Valley, and that 3% is on private land. And so being able to touch the privately held land base and engage them in conservation and preservation is super important to maintaining the integrity of this region that means so much to so many, from tourism to food products to fiber, watershed, etc.
If you know anything about Napa County, you know that it's got a strong winery vineyard presence, and it grows world-class wines. Behind that is the fact that it's a relatively small rural agricultural county, and the concept for the land trust was to come behind the regulatory provisions that were in place with the establishment of the Ag Preserve, I think back in 1968. And so what you needed was permanence coming from agricultural conservation easements. In the 25 years I was at the land trust, over that period of time, we had, when I left, had protected, I think, 54,000 acres of Napa County, and the county is about 500,000 acres, so over 10% of the county was protected through the land trust. That's a little misleading in terms of the agricultural efforts, because some of the things we did were biodiversity, open space, some were protecting state parklands, but probably the most important work we did was in the Ag Preserve in the valley proper, because that was the area that could be reduced and subdivided to home sites.
Marianne and I bought this property. We're developing it very sustainably. It'd be great to think that we're going to pass it on to our kids, and that they and their grandkids and our great-great-grandkids will protect this property in perpetuity, but that's unlikely. The most likely outcome is that we'll end up selling it at some point in time, and hopefully to a lifestyle buyer that has the same ethics, conservation ethics that we have. However, one way to protect that is to set up an easement on this property. We have the right to build 3 homes on this property. Well, we don't need 3 homes on this property. So by putting it in an easement that restricts the development of those homes will never be built. There's lots of places in here that you could take down oak trees and forest and plant more vineyards. By putting it in a trust and setting aside the 100 acres that we want committed to forest, it'll never be able to be planted in vineyards. It'll stay in a forest.
I think landowners' passion about conserving their land comes from their passion for the land. It's almost, in my mind, sort of a self-sorting thing, right? The people that love the land either buy into the land to be a part of that, or they've been with that for generations with their family. And so that passion for the land is the piece you have to really work toward.
When you look at the programs around the country, the programs that are the most successful long-term use all the tools in the toolbox, and they have a strong land use component. I'll say right up front, there's not enough money in the world to acquire the critical mass of agricultural easements needed to protect a viable agricultural industry. That's not to say that that's not one of the tools that you use in the toolbox. So my advice is use them all and have a strong land use component.
We put about 100 acorns across this 1.5 acres over here, and you won't even see the trees for 5 years, and you won't even see good-sized trees for 50 years.
One of the main threats to oak habitat in Oregon is just the lack of recruitment of young trees. So doing this work it may seem silly or not impactful, but it's actually a huge effort. And when landowners do this, then we have a generation of oaks that are going to come to, adulthood as our children get older, and they will then be the big stately oaks that replace these 300 and 400-year-old trees that are starting to fall down.
To me, protecting agricultural land represents an investment in the future of our communities. We're taking an irreplaceable natural resource, and we are effectively holding it in trust for the future so that we have continued access to food production and open space and wildlife habitat. And We are acknowledging and committing to protecting this resource in perpetuity. And I think it's one of the most important things that we can be doing for the future resiliency of our communities.
Some of the threats that we're dealing with, I think sometimes relates to the apathy of people not wanting to get involved, or thinking that we've got a program in place and that it's doing the job, when in fact we do have issues.
One of the real ironies here in Oregon is we've had our land use system in place for about 50 years, and because of that, Oregon actually does look different, and that brings people here to the state because they like the way it looks and feels. Unfortunately, sometimes when they get here and buy land, then they get unhappy about the restrictions that are in place that prevent them from doing some of the things to their land that were done to the places that they were leaving, and that creates something of a conflict. So one of the things we really need to do here is make sure that people understand that Oregon looks the way it does because of deliberate choices that were made, and that we have to continue making those choices in order to keep it this way.
We have 45 acres of vines planted, 5 of Chardonnay, the rest Pinot Noir. And you can get a great view of the vineyard from here. It's the time of year in the Irish tradition of the festival of Lunasa. And Lunasa is halfway between the summer solstice and the autumnal equinox. And it's a unique time because the grapes are just now starting to get to the point where the seeds are hardened, they'll start turning purple, and we're on our way to harvest. And that was the celebration of Lunasa, is the beginning of harvest.
It's got its own little ecosystem. I just love it how these vines, each one of them over the years has got a distinct personality. When they're babies, you know, they all look alike. As they get older, like people, they develop a lot of individual character so that you could almost name each one and say it's got its own personality. This is Pinot Noir. It'll be dark purple, it'll be beautiful, it'll be delicious. Come and taste it.
Thank you for joining us on this tour, and our thanks to Columbia Bank for sponsoring this video. I want to welcome you, if you're joining us live, for a question and answer with Jim Johnson of the Oregon Department of Agriculture, John Hofnagel, former ED of the Land Trust of Napa County, and myself. And our big thanks to Land Trust Alliance for making this virtual video tour available. We hope to see you in 2023.